Walls have ears. Arma, Texas is so small that secrets are hard to keep. Everyone knows each other. Everyone gossips. Russell understands this, so he keeps his mouth shut. Buck doesn't. He's outed by a classmate, forcing Russell to watch his worst nightmares come true. He knows what happens to people like him and Buck. What hurts the most is seeing his best friend in charge of Buck's punishment. Jack is the sheriff's son. In his family, that means he's going to become the next sheriff. And he acts like it. He polices Arma High just like his pa polices the streets. He's responsible for the students in his school. That means Buck. Arma is a Christian town, not where the devil belongs. If Buck wants to honor God, he can't let the devil in. Jack will make sure of that. What happens when Jack finds out that Russell isn't all that different from Buck? Will he be able to punish his best friend too? Hello everyone, welcome to Storytime with Sea Demons. I'm your host, Livy, and today we're reading When Cowboys Kiss. This is a very dramatic friends to lovers story set in a small conservative town in 2016 where homophobia runs rampant. Please mind the content warnings on the screen. This story deals with some very heavy topics. If you don't think you can handle them, put your mental health first and click off. You can always come back later. This is a work of fiction. I don't condone any of the problematic behavior depicted here. My books contain adult content and are intended for mature audiences. Click off if you're under 18. What I will be reading to you today is a YouTube-friendly version of this book, which is abridged and censored. But if you're an adult and would like to read it for yourself, the link is in the description. Without further ado, let's begin When Cowboys Kiss. Chapter 1. Arma, Texas, February 2016. His hair was a fiery mess, face flushed with exertion. He towered over the other two with a triumphant smirk, leaning his weight against a row of lockers. Even though he'd won, the fight had clearly left him breathless. He'd taken on two of his classmates, after all. Not a small feat, although this was Buck. Such an outcome was expected. A small crowd had gathered around him, mindful not to obstruct Russell's view of it. They noticed him despite his distance. Shock kept Russell from reacting right away, focused on the bruises that blossomed along Buck's jaw and the drop of sweat that ran down his temple. His sharp gaze found Russell with ease. "Well, I meant what I said." Buck spoke loudly, addressing Russell in front of the crowd. He sluggishly pushed himself off the lockers. His clothes were wrinkled, t-shirt hugging him awkwardly around the waist. Russell focused on the rise and fall of his chest as he panted. "They're right." "Yeah, no shit, we're right," one of Buck's classmates spat while getting back up. He touched his face where Buck had hit him. Russell was unable to recall his name. The crowd turned to Russell, waiting for his judgment. Since Jack wasn't around, he fell upon his right-hand man to administer a just punishment. Normally, that wasn't an issue. He knew exactly how Jack would want him to deal with a fight like this. He'd handled Buck countless times before. It was only that hearing Buck proudly claim the slurs that his two classmates had just thrown at him seemed, to Russell, to fall outside of his jurisdiction. That wasn't how things were supposed to go. Buck should have denied those allegations. "Well, bless your heart, Buck. I reckon you know what that means." A weak chuckle rippled through the crowd. Oh, I reckon. Russell's eyebrows twitched. Why wasn't Buck denying it? You don't mean that, Russell deadpanned. There was no humor in Buck's features. The seriousness that fell over him was eerily uncharacteristic. His gaze pierced through Russell. And if I do? He challenged. The crowd began to murmur. Disgust scrunched up their noses, disapproval in their gaze. Russell's inability to react was disquieting. He felt his heart begin to race. Are you trying to piss me off? Frustration pinched his eyebrows together, voice close to shaking. He walked up to Buck before a proper response could come out of him, and fisting his t-shirt, slammed him against the lockers. You ain't gay, he shouted. Even though his performance was far too believable, it was only half-hearted. He didn't feel any anger towards Buck right now, which was strange because he'd never needed any reason to hate Buck before. It had always come naturally. This was the first time that hurting him didn't feel right. Why? Panic surged up Russell's chest and closed around his throat. Pulling Buck an inch off the lockers, Russell slammed him back against them. Say it, he shouted. A slow smirk widened Buck's lips. The violence didn't faze him, already expected in the world they lived in. Russell couldn't remember the last time they'd been on friendly terms. It must have been over a decade ago, before Buck had figured out that getting on Russell's nerves was his favorite hobby. And lie? Buck asked. Just say it, Russell insisted, too close to pleading. His voice threatened to crack. Something shifted within Buck. His smugness vanished, eyes flicking back and forth as he digested the look on Russell's face, the fear that drained him of color. His eyebrows set. Say it, Russell whispered, panting now. His knuckles dug into Buck's chest. He'd never noticed the specks of green in Buck's eyes, hazel rather than brown. A strangled sob came up his throat and died. Still, Buck didn't say it. It was one of the teachers who broke them apart, ripping Russell off Buck as his fists tightened and nearly tore his shirt off. That was his last attempt to change his mind. In retrospect, he should have grabbed Buck by the shoulders and shaken him, tried harder, tried one last time. He knew Buck wouldn't give in, though. He never had. He'd rather welcome a world of pain than compromise his integrity. That was the most infuriating part about him, the part that Russell didn't understand. What did he get out of such inflexibility? If he didn't bend, then one day he'd break. In the end, no one got in trouble. When it came to Russell, any issue was as good as settled. He had about as much authority as Jack did, which put him at the same level as his teachers. Arma High had a unique hierarchy. Since this particular case involved Buck, punishment was taken in increments. The scuffle between him and Russell earlier was just the beginning. They had a long history of much more violent fights for far less serious offenses, almost all of which Russell had won. He'd always found that curious, considering Buck was bigger than him. The principal did, however, bring them both into his office for an account of what had happened. After listening to Russell, his face darkened. Russell felt compelled to take a step forward, clutching his trucker hat in both hands. No need to worry, Mr. Barnes. Buck was just playing, he spoke while glancing at his classmate. Right, Buck? Buck hesitated. Right, he reluctantly agreed. See? The principal glanced between them. His fingers were laced together, hiding his mouth behind them. After deliberating for a moment, he brought his hands down. I wouldn't like to have to call Miss Lola in, he threatened. She's a lovely lady, and busy too. No, that ain't necessary, sir, Buck mumbled. I'm real sorry. Is there any merit to what those kids said about that app? Buck turned away. Yeah, it's one of them dating apps. Instead of finishing that sentence, the principal motioned to what he meant to say. His shoulders were uncomfortably tense, as if the mere thought of saying the word homosexuals was enough to make him unclean. For those folks? Buck nodded. That's right. Well, why in the world would you download something like that? I don't know, sir. For the same reason Jason and Caleb did too? Oh, Jason and Caleb. Those were their names. They'd been in some of Russell's classes last year, but hadn't spoken to him much. He had a particular distaste for Jason. His loud and nasal voice got on his nerves. You watch your mouth now, boy, the principal spat. What are you implying? Nothing, sir. Buck quickly backpedaled. I ain't implying nothing. Then you better delete that filth off your phone before I bother Miss Lola with such an unpleasant talk. Yes, sir. The principal turned to Russell next. Does Jack know? He shuddered. I reckon he does by now. Should I call John? No, Jack will tell him. The principal slowly nodded. All right then, you all run along now. I don't want to see your face back in my office this week, but you hear? Yes, sir. Buck nodded. The first floor was mostly empty by the time they left. Quiet chatter echoed in the distance. Russell simmered with rage. His gaze promptly found Buck, sharp under a scowl. Buck's shoulders were lopsided, backpack hanging off a single strap as he rummaged through his pants pockets. His shirt collar had stretched from all the tugging earlier, red flannel hiding most of the wrinkles. He didn't always wear white t-shirts. That was an odd observation to make, Russell thought. And odder yet was to think of how that shirt had hugged him earlier. That shouldn't have made an impression, but it did. Russell decided not to ponder why. Buck's hair was still a bit messy, as if he'd only run his fingers through it once after the fight, and the bruise on his jaw had fully formed by now, a deep purple that colored the paleness of his skin. He was only a couple of inches taller than Russell, and yet, when they fought, that difference seemed to disappear. His attention caught Buck's eye. What do you expect me to say? Buck started. You should be asking Jason and Caleb what they were doing on that app. You already know why I was there. Oh, drop the act, Buck. I ain't buying it. What act? Hush your goddamn mouth now. Well, alright, but this ain't no act. I meant what I told him. Buck shrugged. Russell shoved him. Did you? The strength of his shove caused Buck to stumble back a step. Yes, he shouted, wide-eyed. His face had caught color in this meantime, just as bright as his hair. Grabbing hold of Buck's shirt again, Russell slammed him against the wall. Only this time, something else burned in the pit of his stomach. That confession was the last thing he'd wanted to hear. He leaned over, breathing in the air that Buck huffed into his face. His arms trembled. Do you know what happens to people like you? His voice was a whisper in the inch between them, terror cooling his veins. Buck stared at him, cowering in fear. Then, as if remembering who he was talking to, he relaxed. That was the reaction Russell had expected all along. Had Buck feared him, truly feared him, he would know how to proceed. It was Buck's recklessness that got under his skin, treating Russell's threats as toothless, because, in a way, they were. Russell had only meant them in the moment. Still, they didn't make him harmless, and Buck knew that. He'd felt it. He'd worn the bruises. A slight smirk curled Buck's lips. Remind me, Russ. Russell didn't. The fire that burned inside him wasn't bloodlust, and too afraid to act on it, he pulled away. His breath hitched. Why was Buck, of all people, affecting him in this way? No one should have that power, especially the most irresponsible guy he knew. He wished it'd been anybody else. You have to deal with Jack, you stupid fuck, he spat. His words gave himself goosebumps, breath coming in short. Even though his eyes were dry, he felt as if he could burst into tears at any moment. Buck gave him a strange look. I ain't worried about that. He truly didn't sound like it, pushing himself off the wall with a hand. We're friends. No, y'all ain't, Russell quickly rebutted. You really think you'll still be friendly with Jack after he finds out about your lifestyle? Buck gave him a funny look. So what? It don't matter none. It does. You're a problem now. You're giving him trouble. Russell struggled to keep from shaking. You're his responsibility. He's gonna have to deal with you. Do you realize that? Buck's gaze dropped, finally understanding the gravity of his situation. Russell hated being the one to show him that. Ultimately, Buck shrugged, but it was too stiff, not as careless as he wished to come off. He did actually care, as he should. So be it. He was an idiot. The front doors led to a wide landing before the short steps down to the street. Jack glanced up as they came out, leaning against the railing. He put his phone away and straightened up. Even though he was only 1 year older than the other two, his build and the scruff on his jaw put him several years ahead in appearance. A tuft of brown hair poked from under the bill of his trucker hat. Blue eyes piercing cold. Seeing him seized the breath in Russell's throat, and yet, at the same time, it ran his blood warmer. Howdy, Jack. Buck nodded. Howdy. Jack's eyes narrowed. Are you a bit short of a six-pack today, Buck? What in the goddamn hell is that? Buck shrugged, frowning. Jason and Caleb. Jason and Caleb, Jason and Caleb. Jack mockingly interrupted. I don't give a fuck about Jason and Caleb. Do I look like I give a fuck? He stabbed into Buck's personal space, getting in his face. About Jason and Caleb? Buck stood tall. No. All I'm trying to say is, I was minding my business before they came sniffing about. And I'm damn glad they did. Now, what I don't understand is, when Russ came over to defend you, you still sided with Jason and fucking Caleb. Why? You ain't never needed no one to come and defend you before. Why are you letting them call you a cocksucker, Buck? 'Cause I am one. No. Jack's voice was quiet, head shaking with disappointment. No, you ain't. I am. I can show you too. Jack moved quickly, swinging a punch that connected with Buck's cheek so hard that he stumbled to find his footing. Jack grabbed his shirt and threw him onto the ground. Russell watched him with his heart in his mouth, fearful and disappointed, but still not surprised. That was the right way to react, and he knew it too. But earlier today, he'd hoped, for just a moment, that he was wrong. He'd hoped that Jack would be okay with that. That there was a world in which Jack would welcome that aspect of Buck's, or anyone else's, lifestyle, instead of beating it out of them. Russell knew that that was what had been expected of him earlier, but he also knew that he wouldn't be the one to do it. He couldn't. He couldn't even watch. Chapter 2. Jack sent Buck to the nurse's office before meeting with his pa. It wasn't hard to find her. After all, most of the staff had seen the bashing. It happened right in front of the glass doors. They'd stood by and let it happen, unable to stop Jack even if they'd wanted to, which they didn't. Jack was fair in how he meted out justice. His pa was the sheriff, and Jack only did what his pa told him to. The nurse asked no questions as she helped Buck up and over to her office. Jack caught his breath in the meantime, fixing his hat back in place. His gaze fell on Russell, devoid of either hatred or compassion, a perfectly indifferent glance. Even though he took no joy from hurting others, it also didn't affect him. This was just the way these things were handled. It was what his pa had taught him to do. He flexed his right hand as if his split knuckles were nothing more than a mere annoyance. Buck's blood was smeared all over them, mixing with his own. Instead of wiping it off, he let it cake and flake off his skin. The sight made Russell sick. Since no one was riding with Uncle John today, Jack called shotgun. He didn't need to actually say it, of course. The passenger seat had always belonged to him. And when he was behind the wheel, the passenger seat belonged to Russell. Everything had its place. Everyone had their place. Buck seemed to have forgotten that today. Uncle John gave the two boys a puzzling glance before asking after Buck. The name alone cooled Russell's blood, and as Jack plainly explained what had happened, he brought Russell back to that moment, watching helplessly. He'd never forget how Buck had sounded while choking on his own blood. Vomit threatened to pour in his mouth. How does it taste? Uncle John's strongest reaction was surprise. Buck Allen? Oh, not him. He's so... well, he's a man. A real man, I thought. Just look at the size of him. A damn bull. I know. Jack sounded just as cool and collected as his pa. He surprised me too, but I've handled it now, so there ain't nothing to worry about. Suppose he won't be riding with us for a while. Uncle John scratched the scruff on his chin. That was his tell, letting Russell know that his mind was busy. He felt, sometimes, that he was several moves ahead in a game of chess that Russell wasn't even allowed to watch. He knew how everything in Arma worked, but he'd never explained the extent of anything that they did. I don't suppose he'll be joining us at all anymore, Jack, on account of his lifestyle. Jack scoffed. What I taught him wasn't good for nothing, Pa. You can have my word. Whatever he thought he was, he ain't no more. Uncle John smiled. Russell saw the indicative wrinkles in the corners of his eyes through the rear view mirror. Atta boy. You keep an eye on him, though. You never know. Jack shook his head. Russell didn't have to see his face to know that he was rolling his eyes. I mean it, Jack. Oh, I hear ya. A violent tremor overtook Russell for the fraction of a second. His first thought, upon hearing that exchange, was that Buck ought to learn how to hide better. He knew, however, that Buck wouldn't. His pride wouldn't let him. Nausea nearly forced Russell to empty his stomach all over the back seat. He tried very hard not to think of what would happen once Jack realized his lesson hadn't worked. The rest of that day was difficult to live through. Bouts of nausea kept bringing him back to the bashing and vice versa. He relived it 1,000,000 times in the span of only a few hours. Jack's voice rang in his ear over and over, demanding that Buck walked back on what he'd said, and when he didn't, blood had gushed thicker. Russell had never heard such pitiful whimpers come out of someone as big as Buck. It hurt to hear them, imprinted in his brain. He wished he could have stopped it. Jack had mercifully allowed his inaction, not forcing him to join in, or his house of cards would have crumbled right there. But Buck was his friend, he told Jack. His best excuse, despite how much they fought. Jack knew that, of course. They only fought because they cared for each other. Russell wasn't sure that he believed that, but he decided against antagonizing Jack any further, lest he be the one down on the ground next. The worst part of that day was when Miss Lola called. Uncle John and the two boys were just about finishing up downtown. Whenever he picked them up, they went on patrol with him. Jack and Russell were very large for their age, and because of that, they were able to help during non-violent calls. Since those were the most common type, they got to help a lot. They were fun too, neighbors complaining about each other, couples fighting, weirdos acting out. Usually, Uncle John asked everyone involved a few questions, and already aware of who they were and their history with the law, he acted accordingly. Drunk folks sobered up in jail, husbands were told to control their wives, and weirdos were taken to the hospital. A little shoving was common practice, just to remind them of who was in charge, and if they reacted, then Jack and Russell were allowed to join in. Miss Lola's call didn't come through the dispatcher. She called Uncle John's personal number. He took one glance at the screen, swiped a thumb across it, and brought his phone to his ear. The streets were just starting to fill up as folks left work. "Miss Lola Bunny," he joked. "To all the pleasure." The two boys kept quiet. Russell could hear her very faintly, a high-pitched tone that only told him she was a woman. He didn't know Miss Lola's voice so well as to be able to recognize it on its own. She sounded desperate. Remembering the state Jack had left Buck in, his heart sank. "Well, your boy was saying some pretty silly things," Uncle John continued. "Jack was just doing his best to slap some sense into him is all. You oughta go to church more, Miss Lola. You don't want your boy forgetting what family means." He cruised down the street and, finding a place to park, languidly pulled over. The truck was still running, parking brake on. "I know that. I just think he's letting the devil speak to him. We can only see evil if we know what to look for. Father Lawrence can teach him that." The ice cream parlor they'd stopped in front of belonged to one of Uncle John's relatives. That could be said about half the town. Jack had his window down, forearm resting on the door despite the biting chill. The bill of his trucker hat poked out as he inspected the sidewalk. Russell watched him through the side mirror. "Miss Lola," Uncle John sighed. His free hand pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak of Father Lawrence in that manner. Those are some serious allegations, and baseless too, mind you. I've seen to them myself. He's a man of God and an important member of our community." It was only when Bertie Davenport came out to greet them that Russell realized Jack had been staking her out. She must have noticed him too. Her hair was up in a bun, an apron over the front of her body. Russell didn't remember she worked for Jack's family. "Howdy, Jack," she smiled. The blush that crept across her nose was as red as her lips. "Howdy, Miss Bertie. How are you?" "Miss Bertie," as if she were a proper lady. Russell rolled his eyes. "Mighty fine, thank you. Can I get y'all anything?" "You're far too kind, but we ain't staying. Pod's on the phone." "Oh, right." She leaned down to peer into the truck. Russell saw Jack's gaze promptly fall on her cleavage. His stomach churned. "Oh, howdy, Russ." "Howdy, you." "Are you busy this weekend, Miss Bertie?" Jack asked, looking her in the eye again. "Depends. I close this Saturday." "You close at 5? She nodded. "That's right." "Well, it's college night at the Corral. It opens at 8. The blush on her cheeks worsened somehow. She looked like a stoplight. "Why, ain't that something?" "Sure is." "Miss Bertie Davenport," Uncle John called, putting his phone away. His right hand brought the parking brake back down. "It was lovely seeing you." "You too, Sheriff." She glanced at Jack again. "Text me." Those last two words were only mouthed at him. not spoken. Jack nodded, smiling. The sight burned Russell into cinders. Worse than being forced to watch them flirt was seeing how pleased Jack was afterwards, wearing that smile all the way back home. His pa only teased him a little bit, aware that his son had run laps in this town without committing to anyone. Jack had told Russell that it was only because he hadn't met the right girl yet, but Russell had come to the conclusion that he was just scared of relationships, which was fine. It meant he never let them get to his head. That was how Russell preferred it too. Jack and his family lived at the Reed farm. It was 40 minutes away, isolated by its own expense, a hub of sorts, where everyone involved with the Reed family found themselves at one point or another. Business was very often done at Jack's dining table. Russell, in particular, was here a lot. Jack's parents considered Russell one of their own, so he could come and go as he pleased. This was his second home. Unlike Jack's other cousins, Russell had his own room here, which he hardly ever used, preferring to spend all his time either outside or in Jack's room. Jack's mom was Aunt Marge, Russell's pa's sister. Her maiden name was Marge Russell. That meant Jack was Russell's most distant blood relative. That was always weird to think about, considering how close they were, but it explained why they looked nothing alike. Russell was half Mexican, Jack wasn't. Aunt Marge was just another drop in the Reed bucket. Almost half this town was related to them in some way, and yet, Jack somehow managed to keep finding girls that weren't. It was a miracle. Bertie Davenport, Russell mused. He lay on Jack's bed, watching him get ready for his date, already in his nice pair of jeans and cowboy boots. A half-empty bottle of beer rested on Russell's chest. Her again. Your point? Jack shot him a sharp look through the mirror. His hands fixed the collar of his shirt, nearly buttoned all the way. Russell flashed him a brief frown. You don't usually go for seconds. Running out of options? She's a fine girl, Russ, and I've gone for seconds many times. You ought to pay more attention. To your sex life? Russell made a face. Now why would I do that? You tell me. You seem awful interested in it as is. Finishing up the last buttons, Jack turned around and held out his arms. Well? Handsome as always, Russell absently mumbled. His mind wasn't really present, sort of stuck on Bertie and the flirting from a couple of days ago, as well as the subsequent flirting that he knew would take place tonight. The alcohol in his stomach numbed any reaction he might have to that. He finished his beer off before sitting up. Well, run along then. Oh, you're coming with me. Russell shook his head. I ain't really in the mood to watch you and Bertie flirt all night, but thanks for an invitation. Min Baker's going too. Jack practically sing-songed. The corners of his lips curled into a smirk. Min Baker, Russell echoed. That name sounded familiar. He ran a hand through his hair before fixing his hat back on. Ah, he remembered it now. Cowgirl Min Baker. Jack had taken her virginity in the state park last year, reverse cowgirl style. Jack laughed. Yup, that's the one. Russell stopped at the door. His right hand swirled his empty bottle around. I'll tell you what, Jack. I'd rather watch you and Bertie go at it than fuck Min Baker. Jack's roaring laughter snapped Russell back to reality. Well, heavens to Betsy, Russ. Just put your damn boots on and come along now. What? This ain't good enough for you? Russell indicated his day-old outfit. Not to Min Baker, it ain't. Oh, to hell with Min Baker. Jack dragged him out by the nape of his neck. You thank me later. Russell didn't. He never had. Every time he'd let Jack drag him to a bar, he'd ended up sitting in a corner and getting wasted by himself. Tonight was no different. Min Baker really was there, but she wasn't his type, and he clearly wasn't hers either. Her type was Jack. Everyone's type was Jack. Russell saw her skulking around, watching Jack from the corner of her eyes. A number of his past mistakes did that, sometimes for months and months, waiting for a chance at relevance again. Her friends were doing the same thing. If Bertie Davenport really went off with Jack tonight, then she'd be friendless for the foreseeable future. None of the girls in their school had been friends since Jack had started picking them apart. When Russell's gaze fell on Miss Lola behind the bar, the bashing came rushing back to him. His pulse broke through the numbness. He walked over without thinking and leaned both forearms onto the counter. She noticed him right away. Her fiery red hair was up in a ponytail, dark eyes outlined in black. She looked so much like Buck that Russell felt himself getting emotional. "Miss Lola," he choked out. She crossed her arms. "I can see you're already 3 sheets to the wind, mister. I ain't giving you nothing but water." "No, I know. That ain't it. What did he even want to say? "Buck," he blurted out. "How's Bucky Barnes?" Her shoulders drooped, features softening. "He's doing god-awful," she admitted. "But he's finally home, and that's a blessing." Russell's eyes watered. "Figures," he whispered. I'm... "Save it." She reached under the bar, and taking out a water, slid it over to him. "Go home, Ernie." He stared at the bottle. "I wish it didn't have to be this way. I wish it could have... I wish things were different too, but folks ain't gonna change. At least, not overnight. What Bo's looking for is a miracle. That John Reed." She shook her head. "Well, he's a tough nut to crack, I'll tell you that much." "Bucky's..." Russell promptly lost his train of thought. "That's how I feel about Buck sometimes. I wish he hadn't said nothing. He should have kept his damn mouth shut, like anyone would. His ego. He's on some app. Did you know that? That's how Jason and Caleb found him." "Jason Morris?" She scowled, glancing off in thought. "That's right. What about him?" Her gaze found him again, and in a moment, her scowl was gone. She waved. "Oh, it's nothing. I'm probably confused." "Well, did you know about that app?" "I did. Bo doesn't keep nothing from me." "Oh, well, ain't that nice?" It took him a second to understand what that meant. "Wait, so you ain't upset with him? You knew?" "Why would I be upset with him? He ain't done nothing wrong. It is my understanding that Jason Morris and... Caleb Fox?" "Caleb Fox," Russell nodded. "It is my understanding that those boys disclosed Bo's personal information to the rest of the school. If it weren't for them, none of this would have happened." She paused. "Jason Morris." Her tone was pensive. "Thanks for telling me." "I reckon he's possessed," Russell argued. "That's the only way to explain it, 'cause... well, nothing about him screams sissy. He's big and strong, and he likes to fight. He's manly. He ought to have the false idol inside him or something. There ain't no other way to explain it. He needs God, Miss Lola." She stared at him. "He needs..." His voice caught. "He needs salvation." Her eyes hardened. "Will that be all, Ernie?" The passion that shook him died down. A lump formed in his throat, making it hard to swallow. "I suppose," he told her. "There ain't nothing to be done, is there?" "No, there ain't." A breath left his throat. His head hung forward, arms folding below it. The helplessness of Buck's situation put the entire world over his shoulders. He suffocated, sick to his stomach. Hot tears welled in his eyes. "Should I get Jack?" Miss Ola asked. Russell shook his head. He just needed a minute. A sob came out when he tried to tell her that. "Ernie, how much did you have?" He quickly straightened back up and wiped his face with both hands, sniffling. "I'm fine," he told her. "I'm fine. Don't tell Jack." Worry pinched her eyebrows together. "All right, darling." His body was too small to house the whole of him, constricted to an awkward shape. There was so much he wanted to say. It was easier not to feel anything at all. That way he could wear his body comfortably, forgetting that he was too much, that extra part of him existed. He wished he could cut it out, even if he bled forever. He just wanted to go about life as lightly as everybody else seemed to do. And that's it for chapters 1 and 2. What did you think? Do you agree with Russell's point of view, that Buck should have handled this differently? What would you have done in this situation? I hope you enjoyed these first 2 chapters. Like and subscribe to be notified of the next ones. And if you want to read this for yourself, the abridged version we're reading together is free on my website, and the full uncensored version is on Amazon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Bye for now.